Thank you, Anita, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. It is my real pleasure to welcome you all. And also, it is a real pleasure to welcome and introduce my fellow panelists, friends, experts on this topic that we're here to discuss, a very timely topic of how this behemoth that we call artificial intelligence that is upending the way that we live and work. How do we see these disruptive forces playing out? How do we see the governance of artificial intelligence? And looking at this from a cross-regional and global perspective. So with that, first, let me bring up my fellow panelists. So may I please introduce Helani Galpaya, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Learn Asia from Colombo, Sri Lanka. Ramiro Albru, leader of Futuro, which is, and he's also a lecturer at the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina. Ali Aboud, who's Assistant Professor, Department of Economics at American University in Beirut, Lebanon. Thanks, Ali. Peter Korte, who is a Professor of Economics at the University of Ghana from Accra, Ghana. And last but not least, of course, Ruth Castelblanco, who's a Senior Lecturer at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. So, wonderful to have you all here. Let me just start by first putting my phone down for the second. Let me just first start by really maybe unpacking a little bit what we mean by artificial intelligence for the sake of this conversation. There's different ways of thinking and defining artificial intelligence. Some researchers and technologists define artificial intelligence as a set of computational techniques. That's machine learning, machine learning algorithms, large language models, computer vision systems. So very just very limited to the technological applications of AI. And what this implies is that AI is morally neutral, and what actually matters is how human beings deploy the technology, right? Because it's taking a very just narrow sort of view of technology of AI as just a technology. But another way of looking at it is also viewing AI as a broader social, political, and economic infrastructure. And what do I exactly mean by that? In this context, let's take social, for example. AI is an extension of the social context. That means that AI models and the data that they're trained on cannot be separated from, the social context. The data is a reflection of society. That is what AI is trained on. And so if there's biases in the data, that is what the AI output will also, the algorithms, the outputs of language models and so on, will perpetuate any kind of biases that are embedded within the social context, right? So in that sense, AI is a kind of social infrastructure, and that's just one illustration. Similar can be said for, both political and economic infrastructure. So AI systems increasingly are making decisions about who gets work, right? If you think of a ride-hailing, a company where it's the algorithm that sort of has a great deal of influence over who gets a particular ride, right? And they're increasingly making decisions about who gets work, what kinds of welfare benefits, what kinds of working hours, and various different aspects of the governance of the way that people work, right? It also exacerbates inequality and power asymmetries in the sense that the resources needed to develop the frontier AI systems, and by this I mean compute, data, capital, talent, all these are often concentrated among a small number of companies, right? We know all the the companies that we hear about on a daily basis that are controlling a lot of these technologies, the back end of these technologies, and also a small number of countries. If you think about where the data centers are located, right, they're again geographically concentrated in a few number of countries. So in this sense, AI can be seen as a as an infrastructure, social, economic, political infrastructure that is really exacerbating inequality and different kinds of power asymmetries. It's also, of course, reshaping labor relations by enabling new forms of surveillance, of algorithmic management, of a different kind of fragmentation of work, right? If we think about AI value chains where, a lot of countries, in India and Africa, in Asia and Africa and Latin America, where there's different kinds of data, data labeling activities that happen across the AI value chain. A lot of the labor-intensive kind of work, again, concentrated in the global South countries, whereas some of the more high value-added activities are, again, concentrated in some of the advanced and developed economies, right? And so when we think about these different aspects of artificial intelligence, it shows us that it's not just a technology, but it's actually a social, economic, and political infrastructure that is completely changing the way that we live and work, and it's much more systemic. And so from this follows that AI is rewriting the rules of work, and for the global South, that is developing countries, unlike in advanced economies where we have more formal labor markets and stronger safety nets, in a lot of developing countries we're grappling with high levels of informality, fiscal constraints and debt crises, uneven access to skills, and weaker social protection institutions. So the question in this context is not just, will AI disrupt jobs? Will there be, will it destroy jobs, or how many new jobs will it create? That's not the only question that we have at hand. That is the question that we hear the most about, perhaps, but it's not the only question, right? And in this context, I think it's important to really unpack who will be left behind and who will lead in this transformation, right? And so this panel will explore how AI technologies are reshaping the world of work across diverse economic contexts in the global South, from Africa to Asia and to Latin America. So without further ado, I just wanted to set up a little bit of that context. I have gained tremendously from interactions with my colleagues here, and I'm sure you will all too. So let me start with an opening question to the panelists. And Ruth, let me start with you. What is your assessment of how, and actually I'm posing this question to all of the panelists, but Ruth will come to you first, which is what is your assessment of how AI is affecting employment in your particular region? Who is likely to benefit from this transition, and who is likely to be left behind? How is the AI story likely to play out in your region? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sabina, and thanks for this wonderful introduction. I think the first thing is to take a step back and see what does the region look like. And in this case, Eastern and Southern Africa has quite a diverse historical process of industrialization. You have within the region countries that were developed as settler colonial economies like South Africa that had a very strong industrial base and a widespread process of expropriation, which means that very few people are involved in agriculture. But you also have plantation or extractive economies that still underwent a process of expropriation, but not total dispossession from land, have much more of an agrarian structure, far less industrialization. And so the issue of employment and unemployment looks quite different depending on what the labor market structures are. And I think that's important to take into account when looking at transformation. And then comes, okay, well then along the global production or value chain, Where is it that countries have tried to insert themselves within the AI value chain? And I think in our research, we see sort of 4 core areas. The first is really around mining. So this is sort of an extension of an extractivist development model. Zimbabwe, for instance, has extensive lithium reserves, and so you've seen Zimbabwe become a key provider of natural resources for an AI-driven sort of global economy. The second has been around data generation, which is really widespread. African countries becoming sources of data extraction, although sort of reproducing historic patterns of disarticulated accumulation. That means that the owners of that data are not based in the region, right? The third has been around content moderators. So particularly in Anglophone countries with high levels of education, South Africa, Kenya, and so on, who have tried to position themselves as, for lack of a better word, service providers to the rest of the world. And I think that there is this feeling that many African countries lost out in the first sort of boom in which India and others became sort of key service providers. And this is maybe an opportunity to pivot. But as of course was raised, the kinds of jobs are extremely precarious. And then the fourth has been around the actual sort of downstream effects of automation, of AI, which is roboticization and automation. And here I just want to focus on South Africa for a second, because it raises a question. Where automation has been greatest has been in sectors that have received investment. And South Africa actually, for instance, if you look at manufacturing, has undergone a sort of systemic disinvestment in manufacturing. So it's only thriving sectors that are being automated. But unfortunately, these are the sectors that the government identified as strategic for expansion. So for instance, the auto industry that has been critical to its industrial policy and is considered a sort of success story of industrial policy is also one that's most vulnerable to automation. So I think just to say quickly, I think what we're seeing is overall not a great picture, right? It's one, if we look at these 4 examples, it's of natural resources. We've seen an expropriation of land in order to ensure space for mining with very little employment creation, undermining livelihoods, including rural livelihoods, including women's livelihoods, right? We've seen sort of growing precarity in these kind of gig work things, and then also enterprises using the threat of automation in order to negotiate more precarious collective bargaining agreements. So it's not only about what actually happens, but it's what happens to the power relations between capital and labor, even in sectors that are considered strong sectors. And so the question for us then is, and we'll talk about that in the second round, but what can be done, both in terms of regulation, but also in terms of organizing to give workers greater leverage to improve working conditions.
Ali. Actually, I'm sorry. Peter, why don't we come to you so we stay within the regions first, right? Africa being, we can't have a monolithic statement about Africa in that sense, right? So maybe we also texture it a little bit more.
Right. Well, thank you very much, and good day to you all. Yes, I just want to emphasize the point, just to add to what she said about all the challenges, the constraints, but also to say that we're not going to witness a massive job loss, but also a change in role within jobs with AI. And I see this more with skilled people with skills. People with skills are more likely to benefit from AI than those with clerical skills. And there's quite a lot to see in that respect. So for instance, we see in terms of clerical jobs, writing of minutes, previously attending meetings, you find people go with their secretaries to take minutes, write reports, write summaries, but these days with AI, with online meetings, I think we all witness to that we could get summaries from our meetings without having to use a physical, have a physical presence. Health diagnosis, for instance, is also happening quite a lot in Africa, where we are told that for cancer, for instance, with AI, one could look at 1 million cases and try to pin down on the specific type of cancer and the treatment that goes with it. We find quite a lot happening. I can give examples about data annotation and quality control platforms like Shaman that hires thousands of people trying to translate or transcribe voices and the like, flag harmful AI content. Then we also have AI-powered agriculture, where pest control predict crop yield, output, crop failure. We're finding a lot of this happening. You find within banks, for instance, also using AI quite a lot in terms of in cybersecurity, automation of voices, customer service, jobs. So AI is helping sectors within Africa, except to say that certain kinds of jobs are suffering due to AI. I mean, where it's more manual, where it's more human-centered, some are gradually shifting to new roles. We can see risk analysis and data engineers in South Africa. I mean, these are all areas where we see AI playing a key role. Issues about cybersecurity. My own son is a PhD student looking at AI in cybersecurity and how it's going to be used to address cybercrime, etc. So I think there is a lot happening. In terms of who benefits, again, it is the skilled workers, people with skills, people who are educated, who benefit. The less educated, the less skilled persons are likely to suffer. So women in low-paid jobs, informal sector jobs especially, you find that AI is gradually taking some of their jobs with online purchases. When you have people operating restaurants, etc. These days, those with skills, those with online techniques are able to do online sales, customer service, compared to those where you physically have to be there to operate. So I'm not saying that there are benefits and there are losers as well, and those who benefit are those who are much more skilled. But then the issue about technology, the issue about infrastructure. So if you have good internet services, if you have good electricity supply, uh, then you are more likely to benefit. And that is where some African countries have the challenge. Poor infrastructure, poor internet connectivity, high cost of data, etc. is limiting the benefits of AI. But I must say there are prospects. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Ruth, I wanted to actually come back to you and to see, in some sense, I think, if we're looking at Africa as a region, you've sort of painted a much broader picture looking at, some of the more extractive aspects of the evolution of artificial intelligence. And I think Peter, in some sense, was talking about some of the more granular innovations that can also potentially be seen as productivity raising, and I say that very carefully. Do you have how do you kind of look at both these aspects and reconcile them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, and it's useful to think about specific examples or sectors, right? And so, for instance, if we look at public service provisioning, there are ways in which AI technologies have been used to improve the quality of services. And the question, though, becomes, who owns these? And unfortunately, one of the things that's sort of emerged as a tendency is that the private sector is the only one that's able to innovate, right? And so oftentimes, when the AI is applied through the effective privatization of public provisioning, that then gets tied in with all sorts of other sort of dimensions. If you look at platform work, for instance, in the e-hailing sector, right? One could argue that it's actually created employment opportunities that are maybe better than some of the wage work opportunities in a context where wage work is highly precarious. And I think we're seeing more and more studies that are pushing back against the kind of, linear narrative, let's say. But we also see then, we've seen a proliferation of fintechs, for instance, across the African continent. The way in which fintechs then become embedded within these production processes. And they're almost necessary to keep these business models going because the business models require precarity. And fintechs become a way of promoting a kind of adverse incorporation. And that then follows its own profit logic. And so I don't think that I think that technology ultimately is a tool. And as you said right at the beginning, it's not neutral. But tracing, I think, by sectors and by industries, what is it doing in terms of power relations? What is it doing in terms of the conditions of work is essential? I don't know if that answers your question.
No, absolutely. And I think this idea of, bolstering public sector capacity on the backs of private innovation and therefore monetization is an interesting thing, a phenomenon that I think needs to be unpacked because it's part and parcel of, a capitalist system, right? And so, yeah, so I think that's another really interesting point that you've raised. But let's continue with now the regional overview. And Ali, we'll come to you next. And if you could talk a little bit about how this is all playing out in Southwest Asia and North Africa, SWANA instead of the Middle East,
Yes.
right?
Thank you. Thank you, Sabrina. And actually, when Ruth was speaking, I was kind of seeing the same picture almost with few keywords that are different. So instead of mining, for us, it's oil. The region has been historically driven, the whole regional economy is driven by oil, including for oil-producing countries and non-oil-producing countries. Because despite how nation-states have been well-defined for the past 100 years, the economy has been very integrated. And so, specifically the movement of labor, even non-oil-producing economies are affected by oil through workers and remittances, and the whole regional economy was structured around oil, even non-oil sector. So we have massive service sector, but it's not a service sector. It's non-tradable outside the region, but it is a tradable sector inside the region, where you have a lot of service sectors in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Morocco, or other places that are aimed and focused at customers and clients in GCC countries that are the massive oil producers. And when you think about that, because at the end, part of the exercise we're doing here is a little bit speculative, because we're starting to observe few data about AI and so on, but we're still mostly looking ahead what could happen. So I think the exercise really require looking at the data we have, but also a little bit understanding the structures that exist and how they can potentially integrate. Now, just in South Africa or the South Africa, East Africa region, people thinking, oh, we missed the previous industrial revolutions, we don't want to miss this one. I mean, we hear that also in our region. So we kind of missed the internet, the industrialization, all these things. We've been mostly consumers of all these different products. And we think right now in AI, we want to be integrated into part of the production, the supply chain. So far, all what you see is mostly talks about being for data centers, hosting data centers in our region, because but that's also oil dependent. Because we can produce cheap energy. I mean, not all countries, but the countries that they can produce cheap energy, and so they're capable of hosting large data centers. There were previous also attempt of integrating, for example, the semiconductor industry, which is related to the AI, but these attempts failed, in UAE and Saudi Arabia. But the data centers, these were part of when Trump came to the region with all the big AI companies, Oracle and others, they were negotiating deals with the various governments of the GCC to build data centers that could benefit from the cheap energy that are available there. Now, in terms of how it's that going to affect employment across the board, so far not much. I think right now where we're observing some changes at the services that are associated with the major industries in the region. I think service sectors, jobs consulting, marketing, all these that kind of used to be considered to offer jobs at well-paying jobs. These jobs are being affected because now with generative AI, large language models, you have a productivity boost for these, but then you need less people doing that job. Now again, these these sectors were very highly dependent on oil revenues because the major employer of a lot of these services are governments. So governments employ consultants. Now the consulting sector is still booming in our region, despite like the downturn in other places around the globe. But like in our region, this is like still like a massive employer. But you see also some adaptation from, for example, at the university level, like when you see our students. Like I was telling Umar, like before coming here, like 5-10 years ago, the economics major was a larger major than computer science. Nowadays, computer science is twice our size. And so like you see that people are expecting they need to develop certain skills for these future jobs where they need to to have their proper skills for these future jobs. I think the last point I want to make is also like one thing that's characteristic of so like we definitely have a large informal sector. I mean, it varies from one country to another, but if you think about non-oil countries, it's around 70 to 80% of informality. In oil-producing countries, a little bit lower. But the major employer in the formal sector is the government. And government employment, that's a political choice. Now, I know like when we think about automation, government jobs, bureaucratic jobs are supposed to be easily replaceable by these things. But do governments really want to do that? Do you want like, have millions of people without jobs? That become a political economy question, and we'll have to see.
No, definitely. You raised several very provocative points, Ali, and I'll pick up on just a couple. So I think one of the points about, productivity and the impact on the quantity of employment, right? And I think just to unpack that a little bit, we know that global aggregate productivity growth has actually been coming down. So all of this talk about AI and technology will increase productivity. If you look at the global aggregate numbers, it's actually, the growth has been declining, which is interesting, right? But the other part that is worth considering is that if we do increase productivity, does that mean that you need fewer people to do the same amount of work, right? And so even if you can't have it both ways. You can't say AI is great because it's going to increase productivity, but don't worry, it's still going to create other jobs and because this is assumption-based, but an economic concept that as productivity rises, the quantity of labor needed goes down, right? And so I think that's a really important point that you raised. I also think something that you said about, this conversation is speculative. I'm going to push back against that because I think that's a cop-out. I think that we hear very often that, we are calling it FutureWORKS Collective, but the future is now. We have enough analytical evidence. We don't have large-scale empirical evidence, but we have enough analytical evidence that points to severely disruptive effects of AI, and particularly for certain categories of people. So this idea that we missed the previous revolution, but we don't want to miss this one, like the number of people that actually have the access to the technology, the kinds of skills required to participate, whether our countries actually have the capacity to host the higher value-added activities and value chains. Those are all big questions, right, in terms of the ability of countries in the global south to actually not just participate, but participate on equal footing and potentially even win, which seems really far off in the AI race. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah. On that last point, I mean, I think, so like we have to remember, like most of the technology is being developed in the global north, like in the West, mostly. Especially the technology being like diverted, distributed to the rest of the world, is produced in the West, mostly in North America. And then when you want to think about jobs, like just to give an example, like when I was in Atlanta last year visiting my brother, and then I see I'm walking on the sidewalk, and I see this cart, delivery cart, just like going next to me, or like the self-driving Uber, like driving. I mean, these technologies were developed by private companies and they were thinking about markets, mostly markets that can spend a lot and that have like significant population size. And there is like the contextual element like to it. Like, do we have the infrastructure? Like I was saying, like, when will like the self-driving cart arrive to Lebanon or Egypt? You know, or the self-driving car? Like, do you think the self-driving car will be able to soon drive in Cairo or New Delhi? I don't think so. Like, you know, like, and so I think that will take some time. The technology, yes, it's developed, but it's still not cost effective for a lot of the countries where labor is very cheap. Yeah, I mean, definitely in America, when you know, labor hour costs $20 an hour, they would like to replace these workers with self-driving cars. But I think it's still too early for a motorcycle delivery in Beirut to be replaced by the self-driving car.
Good point. Helani, how are these trends playing out in Asia? And I know Asia, again, huge. So if you want to break it up as South and then Southeast Asia, you know, however you'd like to address this.
Yeah, I mean, Asia is not one Asia. There's China and India, which are kind of going in interesting but slightly different directions. And then there's everybody else who's trying to hang on to those coattails, right? And so, I mean, if you look at something like the World Bank data, interestingly, we have to have a conversation about what this data is. That's also problematic. But anyway, South Asia is the least exposed to AI, and this is where the data problem comes in. That's simply, in a way, looking at the percentage of people employed in agriculture, manufacturing, and basic services. A large percentage of our people are in these sectors, and therefore the assumption is, at least in the short run, these are not highly exposed to AI. So therefore we say, okay, comparing to other regions of the global south, we are the least exposed. Southeast Asia is way more exposed. Then within, if for example in South Asia, just in the interest of time, if we look at it, two factors seem to drive this exposure. One is agriculture, as we talked about, and the skilled occupation categories in a given country are the two things. So India and Nepal, which have high percentage of low-skilled occupation and high agriculture, are the least exposed. Sri Lanka, Bhutan, highly exposed even within this region. So there are country-level differences because we have high-skilled workforce that can be replaced or substituted with AI. So there are these interesting sort of regional as well as in-country trends, right? So what does exposure mean? Does that mean the job is going to go away, or whether tasks are going to be substituted and the job is going to change is a whole other question, right? And as you said, you know, I think the World Bank says the government jobs are the most substitutable. I think we'd all agree it might be easier to deal with a machine than with some government agents. But the policy choice is that it's impossible to fire government workers. So that's going to be the substitutable sector, but in reality a very slow substitution, right? There is, I mean, and also even at firm level, generally the global south and even South Asia, because there's lots of informality and small firm work, technology adoption within the smaller firms and across Asia is slower. So firm level effects, it's not just government policy, also mean that they might be less exposed, right? But we know, we have to talk about the people, not just in agriculture, who might not be. We have a large percentage of our populations working in AI jobs themselves, right, who are exposed. So Sri Lanka, I mean, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh collectively had the largest amount of cloud workers in the world, right? A lot of this cloud work was data jobs for AI, that is image tagging, data curation, and so on. That is already changing, and that is going to drastically change, because we are reaching the point where human intervention is not really needed to tag data. We've kind of covered the internet almost, right? And we can talk about it in the next session. It's a different kind of data that we need. It's not that at-scale data, right? So a lot of those jobs will possibly go away, right? These are sort of the gig work. Then, of course, luckily for us, particularly Sri Lanka and India, if you take, we are also at the higher end of AI, where the software engineering, the model training, some of that, a lot of that is driven by the global north. But these are people who are integrated into global northern value chains, and there's still labor arbitrage opportunities. So they are going through a replacement curve, but much, much slower because it's still quite cheap to hire an engineer. So while the people in, let's say, London in the insurance industry doing the coding are losing the job, they lost the jobs anyway because most of it moved to India. Eventually, that Indian software engineer is going to be replaced by a $200 substitutable, generative AI a month subscription. That cycle is slightly slower, is what I'm trying to say. And there are sort of more concentrated different types of jobs coming up. Then, of course, there is the other infrastructure that supports AI. And while there's, China, big resource extraction in the mineral sector, but other countries not so much. But chip manufacturing, there's huge exposure. And at the moment, in the short run, it's hugely positive because there's such a high demand for high-end chips. There's a huge demand for skill, and those are reasonably well-paid jobs because it's demand-driven, right? So we are simply riding that boom of Taiwan, chip manufacturing and other people needing high-end skills in the foundries or for chip design. So it's interesting things going on even within the region, and if you look at certain sectors in this pure AI sector versus other sectors.
Would you say, when we talk about I like to talk about it in terms of direct impact versus second-order effects, right? So a very simple example, a lot of companies, a lot of IT companies, even in India, have been laying off workers. We see it in the papers all the time, right? Thousands of workers are being laid off. Of course, one could say there's a number of reasons why these layoffs are happening, but the companies themselves, when you talk to them, will say, yeah, AI is one very important factor in these layoffs. Now, all the businesses around those companies that are laying off workers, the places where they get lunch, the other services that they consume. I'm giving an overly simplified example. But there's also cascading second-order effects, right? I'm curious what your thoughts are on the extent to which these second-order effects might exist. Another sort of second-order effect might be, we talk about the potential of AI in agriculture as, bringing a great deal of potential for productivity increases, right? And we can question that whole paradigm to begin with, and again, feel free to question that paradigm. But even if we take that at face value, again, the women, for example, that are laborers on these agricultural farms, do they have access to that technology? Are they going to reap any of the benefits of these, potential productivity gains? Are they going to actually be squeezed even further if the quality of the job improves? So I think that when we talk about, you often hear a lot of, in debates, you often hear a lot of conversation around, but it's such a small, segment of the population, and these countries would largely be, several of these developing countries will largely escape the very deleterious effects of these disruptions. Doesn't seem to be the case if you actually get into the granularity and second-order effects.
Yeah, and I think it's the speed at which different sectors and within sectors, which jobs are impacted. I think the speed, everyone, if you in the long run, like the time we die, everyone will get impacted. In the short run, who's impacted more is a question. I think the interesting thing about AI, because it's this frictionless data that is driving, supposedly frictionless data in these global value chains, what we can be sure of is that most of the value will be captured by the big multinational corporations, and very little will be. So if you look at the overall value chain, I think there will be huge value and efficiencies created. But most of that will be, you see that even in the chips, right? If you look at NVIDIA's market price rise versus the pay increases of the software engineers or the chip designer, these are worlds apart, right? Same way, because it's so data heavy in agriculture, the predictive models on where you should and the weather predictions and all of that, it's a problem. The value capture will be elsewhere. Same way, there's huge non-digital complementarities in certain sectors. So AI, agriculture, of course, knowledge, information, which is the sort of the bread and butter of AI, will have an impact, as we know. But there's a lot of access to capital, access to machinery, all of that has to happen. And our people are already at a huge disadvantage because they, asset-based lending doesn't give them money. There's all these other complementarities. So I mean, in a way, what I guess is like in these manufacturing or these unaffected sectors we talk about, it's not unaffected, they'll just be longer term. In there, it's unaffected in a way because there's so many other problems as well. Access to other non-digital, like the analog complements that the World Bank talks about. Yeah.
Thank you. Last but not least, Latin America. Ramiro, tell us how these trends are playing out in Latin America.
Thanks, Sabina. Well, I have an idea, but then I want to react to my colleagues. So first, I think that is, for Latin America, we need to think AI and jobs as an issue of speed differentials. Okay. For these people. No. So speed differentials between change and responses, or AI, technological progress, and the dynamics of institutions and norms. Because in Latin America, we have an issue with, we can say, institutional and policy inertia. We are really slow to change when we have an opportunity or a threat. So I think that this idea of thinking about speed differentials, things changing fast, and we, institutions, reacting, thinking that we are solving the past problem and we are not seeing the next problem or problem that is here. So I think that that's a way to put Latin America in context. The second element to think about Latin America is the idea of justice, social justice, and AI, connecting these two. Because Latin America is, one word that can define Latin America is inequality. So in each one of these processes of change, of disruptions, we have winners and losers. For example, if you look at the labor market, you will see aisles of modernity in a sea of lagging sectors, with workers using old technologies, with outdated skills, and without proper governance mechanisms. So I think that we cannot talk about AI in Latin America without referring to, well, I'm doing some noises. I'm kind of a robot, I think. So without referring to inequality. So I think that these two topics must be part of the conversation. Policy and institutional inertia, first, and second, the idea that we cannot address Latin American challenges without talking about inequality, right? And when you go specifically to AI and jobs, the topic that we are discussing, I think that we need to unpack a little bit this relationship. First, we have AI use in the workplace. Whatever can use AI. Second, we have AI production, right? So we are part of the value chain of producing AI products, services, whatever. And then we have AI intermediation, right? It's not the visible hand of the government, it's not the invisible hand of the market. It's the hard to see hand of these big firms of the platform capitalism, right? So we have these three dimensions to look at jobs and AI. If you look at AI use in Latin America, I need to go with Samir here saying, if we don't have proper technologies adapted to our context, we will not see big changes in our economies. Because technologies that we are using globally were created for different problems than ours, different contexts. So it's really hard to match without proper investment, new ideas, and so on. So I think that proper technologies is a whole concept. We need to come up again with this concept. Now, if you look at the potentialities around AI use, you will see first that, in a way, it is creating a skilling of the high skill. So if it can benefit medium-skilled workers in the services sector, right? We are running some experiments with people solving problems with or without this type of generative AI tools from medium and high skills, as we see a huge reduction in the gap of productivity, the time of solving the problem. So there's something there, and it's something bigger that connects with Helani's comment on the data on AI exposure. We are not only exporting technologies from the north, we're exporting methodologies from the north. In the case of AI exposure that we use this data, we assume that the level of specialization of occupations are the same. So if you look at an agricultural worker in France, you know, it's a SME connected to market, to a chamber, whatever, and then you translate this type of work to Peru. And it's totally different. Why? Because in Peru, we have in Latin America what we call toderos, do-it-all-yourself workers. Right? You have to do everything. So if you have to do everything, you are not only a farmer. You are a farmer, an accountant, and financier. You need to know about climate. You need to know about how to sell products online, create a website, whatever. And in these type of products, generative AI is critical. So if we are saying that AI is not going to change jobs in low-skilled workers in the Global South, we are wrong. That's my take on that. Because we are thinking about the different type of farmer, different type of seller of products here in the cities. You know, we have people that have to do everything with their own means. So there is a huge opportunity. So in AI use, I see this opportunity. Then I believe with generative AI particularly that we need to think more about female labor markets and generative AI, because there is where we will have big noise problems and opportunities. The direct impact, right? We have about, it's okay, my microphone? Yeah, sorry. So, in a way, it's okay, you listen okay, I can continue? Okay. So, the impact of generative AI, the direct impact of generative AI is mainly on critical work, competing, and in education and health, and technology in augmenting capabilities. So the first three are mainly dominated by women, by female labor. So in Latin America, we experience a long progress in terms of participation of women in medium and high-skilled jobs in these occupations that are under threat or that can be an opportunity if we do the right thing in terms of proper technology. So I think that we need to think about generative AI and gender now as part of the same future that we need to build. That's in terms of generative use. I will quick. In terms of AI production, Latin America is in a huge problem that will be exacerbated in the future. That we have an elite of high-skilled data workers that are part of the global value chain that decides not to be part of our economy in terms of regulation, in terms of taxes, and in terms of innovation and a diffusion of ideas. Why? Well, we need to understand them better. We don't have data about these people. We don't know what to offer, but I think that we need to start thinking about a new social pact with these high skills because they are the future and they are not connected with our economies at all. They don't pay taxes, they don't have regulations, they don't inform, they don't teach others, they don't translate their knowledge to our processes. So there, I think that is a huge agenda. We are even starting, but I think that will be a huge point for the future. And finally, regarding AI intermediation, the platform economy as we know it, I think that I see opportunities, again, because I think that we can see what is hidden, that is the informal economy. We can make known what is unknown, right? But in order to take advantage of the opportunity, we need more capable governments, more capable unions, stakeholders that can start an equal conversation with big firms that own these platforms. If we don't invest in digital literacy, in algorithmic thinking, in creating more capabilities in the counterparts in this discussion with big firms, we will fail.
Thank you, Ramiro. I have 3 very quick questions for you, okay? Very quick.
Yes, no.
Okay. So, number 1, I'm curious, when you were giving the example of farmers that have to do everything, for example, and then subsequently to some of your examples, I'm curious about whether, and I know that you're representing research on Latin America, but that you're very familiar, we've been working together for years, very familiar with other regions. Is there requisite level of education in Latin America higher? And is there a requisite level of education? Because in my mind, you cannot expect, farmers, female farm laborers in India, for example, to be able to do everything just because you give them a technological tool like AI, right? There's a lot of issues there in terms of skills, in terms of requisite levels of education, in terms of access to technology. So I'm just talking about requisite levels of education. Second question for you is, this idea of, you said, if we have the proper skills and if we have the proper technologies, and I was curious about, in Latin American countries, do you think that there is any potential for indigenous innovation around these technologies? Or is it all about importing, if that's even a possibility, right? Because as of now, they're all in advanced economies. Maybe I'll just leave it to those two questions, just really quickly.
Okay. About the first one, I think that if we start innovating on creating and adapting technologies, we can embed the complex knowledge into the app and let them be user-friendly. Of course, there's a limit on that. And I will say that infrastructure might be more an obstacle than skills in that sense. I will say that. But I think that we need to be creative on innovation. If firms are doing that, they're innovating, creating new apps, we cannot think about how to embed knowledge into an app and let the user use it with their own knowledge, with their own technology. I think that we are not even asking this question. Maybe in some cases we are not able to do that, but I think that we are able to do that in many cases, and we are not doing this, right? Regarding the second, in Latin America we have centers of excellence in terms of technology, for example in Brazil, for example in Colombia, in Chile, even in Argentina for agriculture. So we have capabilities there. Of course, now we are in a global wave of saying that governments need not to invest in this, so we are finding some retreat in that. But I think that we have some capabilities that we need to leverage, but the knowledge is there.
Thank you. Peter, actually, we come to, why do I keep giving away my mic? Ramiro, you mentioned, you talked about infrastructure as being really critical. And Peter, I wanted to come to you now to talk a little bit about sort of, there are several countries in Africa that are trying to develop tech hubs, and the infrastructural capabilities are absolutely critical, right, in order to be able to do that. So we've talked about technology access, about developing AI, about skills and education, but what about just sheer infrastructure? To what extent is that, in your view, important, existent in the African context?
It's very critical. Infrastructure is quite key in that respect. But, in most African countries, it's also become a challenge because infrastructure in terms of internet access itself is a problem. The cost is also a problem. So I think we have to look again at the infrastructure issue. Africa becoming the tech hub and a lot of interest to develop the AI technology, deploy AI technology, but infrastructure remains a key. Then also electricity. I think this morning we had even in South Africa, which is relatively a high middle income country, is even facing electricity problems. Same with many African countries where power is a major problem. So you could have the infrastructure, you could have the tech hub, but if your electricity supply is not flowing, you don't have solar systems, then it will not work. So that is a major problem. But not just with infrastructure. I think there are other things, critical factors that has to be looked at. Skills, for instance, is quite critical. Many of the universities and training centers are improving the skills with new technology with new computers, AI techniques, etc. But it still remains a challenge for many to teach some of these courses. Also related is the low acceptability of some of these AI techniques. Because as a government, if you have high numbers of low-skilled people and you want to deploy AI technology that will kick the same people out of jobs, it becomes a problem. If it's high skill, then when you introduce technology, you train them, you enhance their skills, you can engage them. But when it is so low and the number is quite huge, then government policies to support some of the AI techniques are quite limited in that respect. There is also informality. Informal sector accounts for over 80% of the economy of many African countries. So you can't deploy AI in every business, especially where there is informality. When you deploy AI, in some cases, it will kill those jobs completely. It will make them redundant. So I think in as much as Africa is becoming a tech hub, there is still quite a lot to do. STEM technology is being, STEM training, STEM institutions, technical education is on the increase rapidly, but I think there is a lot of catch up to do. And finally, cost and access. It is quite expensive to deploy this technology because they are manufactured in the West, in the North, before they are then shipped and deployed in Africa. So it becomes much more expensive, and also access is also quite limited, becomes quite limited. So I think it's moving, it's getting better, but one area I would push is to support the infrastructure setup, to support the development of some of these AI techniques, because we become end users. And when you are end user, when there are benefits, what accrues to you, not just in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and everywhere, I think we are more of end users than developers. I'm not saying we are not developing, we are, but in proportional terms, we are more end users. And therefore, all the benefits we are talking about, much of it accrues to the North than to the South. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I think now I'd like to shift a little bit from how AI is kind of playing out to what kinds of policy frameworks, what kinds of regulations, governance is required in order to actually be able to harness the benefits and at the very least minimize the costs, right? And in that context, I mean, we've touched upon several aspects. We've touched upon the need for infrastructure in order to be able to even sort of develop and use these technologies, use AI in a context that is relevant to countries in the global South. We've touched upon the need for education and skills. We've touched upon the sort of very briefly on the value chain and how there's inequities in terms of the benefits that accrue to the workers that are at the low end of the value chain and the monetization that happens where the benefits accrue to mostly developed countries and advanced countries and big companies that are able to take up these, the profits and so on. So there's a lot of work to be done, right? Clearly. If we buy into the fact that AI is this great thing, it's going to, bring development, has the potential to bring development, has the potential to raise productivity, there's job disruptions, but maybe new jobs will come that we haven't even imagined yet. Those are all the common arguments that we hear, which aren't really, none of these arguments are accurately playing out when you look at real world examples from everything that we've just heard, right? And the problem is not AI itself, it's everything around it. So the everything around it, Ruth, the policy frameworks, what do we need in order, like in the African context in particular, what do you see as being the key policy interventions, the regulatory interventions, the governance interventions that can actually enable a better deployment, use, production of AI?
Thanks. Many countries are now developing AI policies. And the AI policies tend to focus specifically on what my colleague Peter has just said, right? So thinking about the infrastructure, thinking about the skills, and also starting to think about innovation. My own university, Wits University, has set up the Mind Institute, which has actually done really interesting work in promoting sort of machine learning across the African continent, with many interesting innovations emerging. So I don't want to be a pessimist, right, and discount the important work that is happening on the African continent to think about sort of where AI can fit and how that fits into sort of innovators and the role of universities, including public universities, in being able to support that. But I do think that there's a question of power, right, that emerges. And so I just wanted to throw out some of the experiments, I guess, that governments have been experimenting with in the region. And, on South Africa, there's been a lot of attention paid to the Competition Commission as a place that can try to break apart market concentration. So my director, Imran Balodia, one of his arguments for one of the challenges South Africa faces, particularly in terms of sort of having small-scale production, is that there's just highly concentrated, and this is an inheritance of the apartheid period, right? Highly concentrated capital that basically crowds out any alternatives. So what is the possibility of a competition commission and competition law in breaking apart monopolies and giving more power to domestic innovators and to other kinds of alternatives, including alternative business models? Obviously, that has to be linked with some kind of industrial policy that supports endogenous innovation. And one of the challenges is that oftentimes in the region, when we speak about industrial policy, we're thinking about export-oriented industries, right? And as I mentioned briefly in relation to the auto sector, these are sectors that are often undergoing roboticization much more quickly. And so while they provide oftentimes decent work, including unionized work, they aren't necessarily large employers of people. And part of, I think, the challenge, particularly for countries that had a very large industrial base, is how do you support small-scale industrial production? So I think that that's also been an area of growing debate. Obviously, there's the question around labor regulation. South Africa actually, in its national minimum wage law, defined worker as someone who's subordinate, though not necessarily in an employment relation. So under that definition, platform workers could in fact be workers. But what's very interesting is that actually South Africa hasn't moved to incorporate platform workers as workers with the kinds of established labor rights. And why is a political question, whereas countries like Kenya have, though have done so on very, I would say, unfavorable terms, redefining, reasserting that platform workers are self-employed and so on. So I think there's a lot of scope there for improving the kind of regulations that are going forward, but that constitutes a wedge that I think we can learn from. There are, I think, also, in thinking about regulation, labor, including labor regulation, we have to think about all of the sort of third parties that get involved in many of the business models that have emerged. So I spoke briefly, for instance, about fintechs. If we're going to regulate platforms, we also have to regulate the various entities that intersect with those platforms. And sort of fintechs pose a real danger, I think, to the livelihoods of platform workers, partially because they're using technology to do some of the things that, users used to do back in the day with intermediaries. So we see a kind of reproduction of traditions, but under the guise of technology. And so rethinking labor regulation and then taxation also. How is it, there's a growing pressure on governments to kind of fill the gaps in these increasingly precarious through, for instance, social protection and so on. But that's happening at a time when governments are less and less able to tax to be able to actually provide those services. And then I think that there's another interesting example from South Africa, which is specifically around, well, how do you negotiate better working conditions among precarious workers beyond regulation. And here, collective bargaining has historically been one of the mechanisms through which workers have been able to improve conditions. And in the context of South Africa, post-apartheid, one of the things that was introduced were bargaining councils that basically allowed you to extend conditions to groups of workers that were in a sector, even if not in a particular firm. And I think looking at these experiments will help us think about how is it that we expand labor rights that have historically been in standard employment to workers that are sort of beyond those. And there are structures that have been used in the past with their problems, but I think we can learn from. I think obviously to do this, there needs to be organization. And if there's a central lesson, it's that you can't move to regulate or to extend rights to workers without them being organized. And there is a real question about the role of trade unions in this. So whereas, for instance, in Kenya, the Transport Workers Union was very proactive in changing its internal mechanisms in order to be able to kind of extend its mandate to platform workers, even though they weren't legally defined as workers under the labor law. That hasn't been the case in South Africa. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that we have, not advanced in the way that we would want to. But I think that there is still a sticky issue around what happens, what kind of global coordination is necessary. So taking the case, for instance, of the data workers, right, in Kenya, who organized into a union, only for Meta to then cut the contract with Sama, for Sama to then move to Ghana, and then to threaten to cut the contract and move to the Philippines if there was no organizing. What we're seeing is a kind of digital sweatshop model, but that in many ways is even more difficult to organize than the sweatshops of the 1990s and the 2000s, because the sources of value for digital capital are so diffuse that the organizing that you would have to do is diffuse. It's, I was involved in earlier rounds of organizing in the textile sector, right, in solidarity organizing, where students would leverage in the global north, in the US and other places, they would leverage their consumer power of their universities to pressure companies like Nike and Adidas to support the sort of, or at least not to obstruct the organizing efforts of workers in textile companies in the global south, right? That there was a kind of consumer power that could be concentrated. But where are the choke points in the AI value chain? And I think that that's one of the things, we don't have enough information, actually. And going back to, I think, I forget who said that we don't have enough empirical information actually about how this is all playing out, but trying to identify where those choke points lie is inevitably going to be essential to thinking about where it is that you build worker power, where it is that you can strengthen collective bargaining, push for regulation, and sort of advance these policy proposals that, I've gone through a long list, but anyway.
So just in the interest of time, I'm going to just ask the panelists if anyone wants to come in with an additional policy proposal that Ruth hasn't already covered, right? Because she's talked about competition law and the Competition Commission. She's talked about industrial policy. She's talked about labor regulation, taxation, organizing and collective bargaining. So are there other specific policy interventions? Yeah.
It's not really, it's more about thinking about what's the challenge. In the sense, it's AI and technology has raised this issue that is similar to what we face with the climate negotiations. Like, you have the transnational kind of parameter that's there. It's like platform, because when Ruth was speaking, I was thinking about platform jobs, and you have in our region, you have digital companies that are based in UAE or Saudi Arabia that are, employing mostly people outside of the national borders. And then how do you then do bargaining, wage bargaining in that case? How do you also provide social protection programs? Who's gonna finance these programs when the value is being generated in another geographic entity? The workers are not well paid in these entities, and so how are governments going to finance social security, unemployment benefit, and all these things? So I think in a sense you need to think especially in regions that are highly like economically integrated, you're going to need to think about how taxation is going to work, how regulation is going to work across nation states. I think that's like one problem that we see in our region.
And that's actually also true within countries, right? In India, several states are coming up with bills trying to create a social welfare system through welfare boards for gig workers. But it's the same thing. If the platform is registered in a different state, it's outside the jurisdiction, right, of the particular state that's issuing the regulation. So what can you do? It really limits the power, even within countries, not just between them. But yeah.
Can I add to, from Latin America, I think that we are doing a lot of progress in terms of platform regulation of platform work. In several countries in Latin America, we engage in a fast learning process over 3 or 4 years, we can say, and now we are seeing the results. But I want to focus on what in Latin America call the AI national plans, as a development plan, but AI. We have several of those in Latin America, and I think that we can classify them in like 3 groups. I'm not going to give names because I'm going to criticize. There's a first group saying government will do, and it's kind of led back to the 50s when we were, we will dominate, we will create our own algorithms. But you are not going to learn from others. No, we are going to create our own. Okay, go. Maybe you can do that. I doubt it. That's one. Then we have something new that is only markets will do. That is, let's talk with Elon Musk to have a data center, and with that we will create jobs. What? How? We don't know. But several countries are pushing for a meeting with some high-tech, men, just to convene a data center, and with that we will start a revolution, a digital revolution. And then we have I think, hands-on, serious governments that are creating good plans. And we have 3 or 4 of them that have some provisions in the labor part. I mean, they work on digital rights, data governance, many issues, but in the labor part, they work a lot on AI production, value chain, and innovation. There's a lot to unpack and to think for other countries. Then they have some provisions for AI use in the workplace, right? It's limited, but I think that if you look at Latin America, this landscape of these AI national plans, we all have one of those in all of our countries. So you can see that something is going on there. With these two two opposites, you can say, but then a lot of rich experience in the middle.
Infringing on people's rights, and it's an area where a policy or regulation is quite important. Then the issue about security itself, AI security, where protection of the AI systems to avoid instances where people's data will be breached, people's financial resources, so everything can be breached. So these are critical areas where we need policy to develop.
Global negotiations, I couldn't agree with you more. We are beyond the point where we can be solving a lot of these problems at a national level because the value chains are global, the capital flows are global, and labor flows are now global as well. And we have to. I think we need to move to a climate negotiation kind of situation to sort of stop extraction. Second, I think policy making in itself, while Asia also has all of these, we are very much on the we will do everything and it's going to be amazing. And then when the job losses come, that's going to be labeled as unintended consequences, which is really stupid because we know the unintended consequences we are going to see. So that to be not reflected in the planning and to allocate X% of your budget to pay those people who are going to lose a job is just really stupid, right? We're stuck in these 4-year political cycles of policymaking where you can't say any negative thing of even a good policy that you're putting together. Now, of course, a big part of the policy of what's going to happen to minimize the negative is social protection, right? I don't think, like, we are beyond the point. It's like, it's a little bit like advertising. Everyone would have been better off if no firm advertised because you have more revenue. But once one firm starts advertising, everyone has to, right? So once a few countries started going after the productivity gains of AI, now we all have to, because otherwise the natural extension of this is if we don't, and we're just going to have social protection, we're not going to have enough money. So value capture from AI is as important and goes hand in hand with social protection because you won't have money to pay your social protection programs, right? So these two things really do need to complement each other, the growth story and the protection story.
Helani, just stay with that for a second. On the first point of global negotiations in the way that we do it for climate, how effective are these? What is the mechanism by which this actually happens? We are currently living in a time where international mechanisms are actually being dismantled. So how does that happen? And is it really effective? I mean, I, for one, am skeptical of many things, and that's one of them. It is sort of the ability in today's climate in particular to harness international negotiations. Don't things get watered down to the sort of least common denominator without nuance, without actually any effectiveness to the realities of people's lived experience?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. So negotiations by definition are where you come to, let's say, the least common denominator? Yeah, least common denominator, right? But I would argue in the long run that's still better. And the other option, which is a tiny country like Sri Lanka trying to do it on our own, is not even an option, right? I mean, every platform will move out, right? Because of this global nature of this kind of work. That's the problem, right? So you can either have nothing or you can have a little bit of something. But if you look at the large, let's say, powerful institutional strategy, is at this moment to avoid one single global forum for negotiation, especially in digital. What you see is forum shopping, right? If you look at global taxation, you have WTO, you have UN doing something, you have different OECD trying to do something, and civil society and governments are exhausting their money, going to every different forum. The AI summit is happening, trying to get something out of somewhere instead of one forum. It's very easy for Meta and Google to send 10 representatives because it is their job to go to each of these forums, right? Whereas for civil society, raising money to go to these labor organizations, just to be present is so, so difficult, right? So the cards are stacked, I fully recognize it, but I really see it as a choice. And there's really a sort of a regional and big country play, like where India goes, South Asia will go, right? India can dictate terms, right? Maybe SADC can dictate terms, or the East African bloc, because they act together, can dictate terms. And everyone else can then hang on their coattails and go with it. So there really is a sort of an economic power conversation to be had here. China, definitely, we know on the internet, they're on their own internet. Every company in the world has agreed to this, so they can dictate terms. And I think where they go, other little economies will also go.
Great, thank you, Helani. I'd like to now open it up for questions and then see. Are there questions? Maybe we'll start. Let me start with right here. Do we have a microphone? Yeah, great. So yes, please introduce yourself and then ask questions.
Hello, I'm Dr. Papia Sen Gupta and I teach in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Thank you all for very, very interesting, snippets, I would say. I have a question that, when we know about the way, labor is going to be impacted, in the global south, there is this political question about the state. The state, rather than strengthening and empowering, labor through the labor code, is actually diminishing the labor power. Right? And I think, it's not just, that a particular political party is gaining or something out of that, but it's really critical because if the labor loses, the country in the long run is going to lose. Right? And so, what are your views on it? Because in my country, trade unions, strikes have been declared illegal. right? So how do you actually see that people are going to even come together, for bargaining? Forget about gig workers, even formal workers do not have that power. The second thing I would just like to say is, we have been talking about a lot about innovation. Innovation, I know from my own studies, Global South is really, it innovates with the least amount of resources. It's another thing that when it comes to IPR and copyrights, they do not have, right? They are owned by people elsewhere. But the government does not, and they are investing. What about investment? We have, not even 2.5% of our budget being invested in education and, in higher education. So, whatever, your ideas on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for such enlightening dialogue. My name is Madhuri and I am a student at Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University. My question or my curiosity surrounds the question of inequality, which Ramira, I think, raised. Like in the context of recently we saw the World Inequality Report, which flags that top 1% of the people own more than 40% of the wealth. The interesting part is that 3 global South countries like Brazil, South Africa, and India are on top, most unequal countries, or least equal countries, I should say. And in this socio-economic landscape, introduction of AI, as flagged in the beginning of the dialogue, that it is going to exacerbate the inequalities, like the islands of prosperity and oceans of poverty. So how do we see that in terms of introduction of AI at this critical juncture where, like, the billionaire Raj? And thank you. And I have second question, sorry. I think some suggestions were provided, like the policy governance. I would like to ask one question regarding the, we see, in capital labor relation, the contradiction of interest and sort of that. So in terms of that, our Professor Prabhat Patnaik introduced 5 basic fundamental economic rights in labor justice. So how do you, and which will be financed? He sort of, he suggested 3 measures to, curb the inequality, which is the wealth tax, inheritance tax, and 5 basic economic rights, which will be financed through these taxes. So how do we see these building up in the Global South? Thank you so much.
Let's take those 2 questions and then we'll do another round. And I'll come back. Yeah, I'll come back. So, so the first question regarding innovation, and then the second question with, I really do not, I have a very love-hate relationship with this microphone. So the first question with respect to innovation, and the second question with respect to islands of prosperity and oceans of poverty, as you said, right? So the idea of AI exacerbating inequality, and does anyone want to take either of those questions? Ramiro, do you want to start? Because specifically addressed to you. Sure.
Well, I think that I'm kind of optimistic, but with a big but. You can say that we need to do things differently than in the past. So it's kind of because of course that the technologies associated with generative AI are created for the use of rich people in our countries, not for the other segments. So how we can think that they will use for something if they were not created for that? So let this process alone, we will have more inequality. In a way, and we are actually, in Latin America, creating, there's a divide in the making with these status quo policies. Now, there are some examples and a lot of avenues for starting to do things differently. And this technology for generative AI, I believe, has smaller costs of entry, barriers to entry, because it's cheaper, because it's part of our usual apps. It's not like a machine in the 40s, last century. You know what to do with this machine, how to produce. So I think that there are many reasons to be optimistic in potential, but I think that, at least in Latin America, we need to innovate fast in terms of policy and responses. Of course, there are some critical and expensive decisions to make, that's more complex, but then we have other decisions that are not that expensive, and I think that we are not going in that way. So I'm optimistic, but with this battle changing landscape policies and narratives.
Let me quickly, it relates, the point about inequality relates to the point I raised earlier, that for most countries in the South are end users of the technology. So once you don't develop, but you are the end user, certainly the inequality between the global North and the global South is going to widen, because we are end users, we are not developing. And so it relates quite well. And then also about governments. If you look at government investment in education and also the proportion in innovation, it is quite low. Governments across many developing countries don't invest much in innovation. And of course, if you don't invest, you don't expect to reap from the benefits of innovation. So these are quite important points you raised, and they are interrelated very much. Thank you.
Two quick things, I guess. Government investment is important, but possibly not, not India, but so many governments in Asia, the poorer ones, are very close to being bankrupt, right? So I don't think we can have a strategy of investing more government money. So that's a real challenge, and I don't know what the solution to that is. I think also the classic innovation indicators of patents filed and number of papers written and published are not always a good indication of value capture within any industry. That's the second thing, right? So I think it's a more nuanced conversation. On the inequality thing, I couldn't agree with you more. We live in a capitalist society, yet I think one of the least and most poorly regulated things is capital. We regulate the flow of money for anti-terrorism, for example, with huge effort. We don't regulate the flow of money for increasing inequality, right? So we need to have an ethical regulation as much as economic regulation on capital. That's fundamental. So the things you talked about, wealth tax as opposed to income tax, absolutely vital. Inheritance taxation, absolutely vital. So these are these macro level conversations we really should be having about capital, which drives everything. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Maybe we'll take another round of questions. Wow, that's a lot of questions. Okay, that's good. So why don't we start with that gentleman, because he had his hand up first, and then we'll come around.
Good evening. My name is Ramit. I have been working in the development sector for more than 2 decades now, specifically rural development, local government, climate change. My specific question is that if you look at the SDGs, SDG 9 talks about industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Artificial intelligence, we have been seeing all across the world. Of course, there are very contradictory opinions about how AI should be looked at, but then it is also contributing very substantially to the carbon footprint. So do we see, and since you are experts sitting here, because I am still myself struggling whether to prioritize artificial or natural intelligence, do you see a future where AI will be looked at something as a sustainable tool, or is it something that we are looking at reaching a peak, and ultimately, again coming down, and people coming back to the traditional technology, or at least the IT systems that we had developed a few decades ago. So that's something.
Thank you. Yes. This gentleman here. Okay, well, why don't we take that question first? Sorry, just 1 second. We'll take that one and then we'll come to you. Just because the mic is there, it makes more sense.
Hi, my name is Ipshita Banerjee. I have about 2 decades in development sector, journalism, and a bit of foreign policy messaging. My question is actually related to what this gentleman brought up. There's another school of thought with the World Economic Forum report that I noticed called The Future of Jobs that says that the only skills that will survive beyond and after the 2030s, the human-centric skills, which is negotiations, storytelling, personal branding, strategic thinking, and others. AI is a bubble, it is a tool, it'll kind of be supportive and play a support cast role, much as we have kind of gotten into these frenzies when printing press came in first, and we were like, oh, this is not good for our ethics, and this is not our culture. And then there was the whole dot-com bubble. So this too shall pass is another school of thought. Do you think that this disruption, therefore, is a temporary disruption, which later on then translates into a workforce which is again stabilized? So, much like printing and auditory modes of communications become podcasts, this becomes something else. Do you think this is a transition that we're going through?
Thank you. Maybe, Kripa, we'll take one more here, and then I'll come over to this side in a second.
Hi, my name is Rahul. My question is, humans are naturally creative beings. Humans need creative happiness because we have creative brain. What is the role of creativity in achieving happiness in AI society?
Thank you, Rahul. Should we take a few more, or should we? Is that okay? Can we take a few more questions? Okay. So, wow. Okay. So we're going to do 1, 2, 3, and then you, sir. So we'll start here, and then that's it. We'll take 4 more questions.
Hi, I'm Dipti Bhattacharya. I'm a research scholar at Delhi School of Economics. My question is that in India, or in any informal economy, we see a lot of small and micro firms that are not able to scale up because of capital and credit constraints. In India in particular, a lot of the small and micro firms do not want to scale up because they don't want to come under the ambit of labor laws. Now, in this context, how can AI actually, or will it actually help the small and micro enterprises to scale up? Because we still see that adoption of AI is concentrated heavily amongst the large-scale firms, the ones operating in the formal sector. So what will be the linkages between the informal sector enterprises and adoption of AI?
Thank you for the question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Anjana Dubey. I'm Chief Policy Officer in the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. So I was attracted to this particular conversation mostly with the word justice, labor justice. Now, when we talk about justice, you need to have both the parties around. Okay, so when we look at this framework, we have the labor, we have the consumers or the citizens, we have the governance framework, and we have the organizations there. Now, to me, this aspect of the talk is somehow missing to me. I do relate to, I think, what Helena just said, that in these terms, we may need to see global as the entire management, which is running the AI. Of course, consumers are everywhere. Each one of us wants cheaper products and better value for ourselves. So in that kind of a context, how do we see justice for labor? Can we put it in a framework and then kind of develop what can be the justice that AI should provide? Thank you so much, if anybody.
Thank you very much. We'll take, Vidisha, we'll come to you next, and then, sir, and then your question. Yeah, at the back, please.
Thank you. I'm Vidisha, work with iWage. So recently at iWage, we had conducted a study where we looked into the grievance redressal mechanism of the platform companies, and we found that the AI-led chatbot system that is almost replacing the human supportive system in the grievance redressal mechanism. And according to the workers, it's making the grievance redressal mechanism ineffective. So I would like to know from the panelists, from the context of their countries, similar examples where AI, instead of enhancing the experiences, is actually worsening it, and hence its usage should be regulated in those contexts.
Yeah, thank you. Sir, yeah. Just short, please.
I'm Raj Chaudhary. I'm an environment and energy consultant. My point is, since AI has had the potential to bring in drastic societal changes and societal interactions, while accepting the good things, the government has to take the onus of addressing concerns for equitable access, then capacity building, and at the same time its abuse. So since each of six of you is stationed in a particular country, I would like to know, for a comprehensive takeaway and leaving this room, what is the policy suggested by each of your countries?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. So lots of questions. I'm going to open it up rather than going one by one, or maybe let's go one by one. Just final thought, final one thought. It can either be a response to the question, or it could be something else that you're really burning to share. But no more than a minute, please.
Okay. I think I'll go back to your initial question, which in some ways is, look, AI is a child of austerity, right? Or structural adjustment. So it's kind of emerging following a process of deregulation and financialization, which led to the rise of footloose capital, an attack on unions, which led to a process of informalization that preceded this particular moment, tax evasion, austerity, the privatization of public services. So it's taken a form that maps onto previous rounds of neoliberal restructuring. So is it possible, all of these proposals, can we actually get those? And I think that here it's important to really think about, well, where is organizing actually taking place? And certainly, workers are organizing. But the question is, where is it that workers have structural power? How is it that we identify choke points? Are those where they have historically, where we historically imagine them to be? Or are the pressure points actually something else when it comes to increasingly concentrated capital? Like, I don't know, the stock exchange, shareholders, so some ideas. But I think that we need to think more creatively about how it is that you build a workers' movement, at what scale, and who is included in it. And it's true that many governments are swinging or have swung to the right, and the attack on workers is very much part of that. It's also true that we've seen across Eastern and Southern Africa what people are calling the Gen Z revolution. And although it's not clear what the political direction of these various political uprisings will be, all of them share some common grievances, and I think those are putting pressure on governments to think about how to respond, if only because they want to stay in power. And I think that it's incumbent on us as researchers, but also connected to social movements to try to steer the conversation in a way that can create the conditions for some, perhaps, of those policies to be introduced.
Thank you, Ruth. I mean, I think Ruth says it all, but I'll try to add a little bit to that. No, actually, I mean, again, go back to your question about why governments are why they have no interest in regulating things. I think they're all mostly afraid that they're going to miss out, and so they think this could generate massive revenues, and that could integrate the country into their respective countries into the global supply chains. And I think the other thing that Helen mentioned, most countries in the global south are in debt, and they're facing major fiscal problems, and so but then that's again also comes with the dominance of neoclassical economic thinking, where it's deregulation will bring investments, will integrate us into the global economy and bring more revenue. So I think that's the main thing. The other thing about that you also talked about, the question was about innovation. I think the process of innovation goes from research, then integration into companies to basically mass produce. I think that's one thing that's missing in the global south. And I think here that governments do have a role, because if we look now at where's innovation happening in the world, okay? Some of the big countries, like the US, China, India, these are countries where, but then governments in all these countries are playing a massive role in directing capital. Where do we want to invest? Where are what are the innovations we want to produce, and how to integrate these innovations from their starting point in research centers and universities into like coming up with mass production of. I think that's like what's missing in a lot of the small global south countries, and why governments don't do that. One, I think funds are definitely an issue there, but also like a lot of time it's just like you get used to being a follower. You know, like you don't think that innovation can happen here, and you just think innovation is going to happen elsewhere, and you're going to consume it.
I guess I'll take maybe two questions. One was about sort of industry infrastructure, and I think energy. There was a question somebody called Ramit. So, and the connection to AI. So right now, I think AI is on this huge accelerated journey to build as many chips and as many data centers as possible and sucking up as much power as possible. There's not enough attention on sustainable green power and green energy. I think that's part of the problem there is that when we consume AI, when we go and ask a cat video to be created, none of us are really conscious about how much exhaust is now being put up by this whole value chain, right? But we have come to this point, let's say airline industry, very routinely, most companies will pay a carbon offset before you fly, because it's, right? That's, at least from a consumer point of view, that's the stage we need to get to. That complete awareness that every browsing you do has a cost on the environment is just really well hidden. So we need to make these transparent, we need to calculate the impact of it, it needs to be retailized and individualized. You, of course, need policy around this as well to force the speed at which the industry of AI goes green. And I think here, our region in particular has an advantage, right? More, 2/3 of the green energy jobs are in Asia. 50%, I think, is of that. 2/3 is in China. A lot of that is export of green energy stuff like solar panels and blah, blah, right? So imagine how much revenue capture, value capture we can do if there's a global movement to clean energy in AI. So I think there is a potential, we just need to accelerate that, right? Because right now the companies are just, increasing prices and taking energy from other people instead of like fundamentally change the conversation. I think this question about, WEF saying, oh, this is a temporary disruption. I think that's a really interesting one. It came from somewhere there in the, look, I think the printing press is one, the industrial revolution is one. We now do a lot of reading on the industrial revolution and say, oh God, things are so much better as a result. But actually, the period from which it started to when there was some kind of settling was awful for a lot of people, right? There were no social safety net. People died, right? That in-between period was terrible, right? And that was majority sort of European global north situation. Now we are talking at scale, much larger population across the whole world, and it could be way more awful as well, right? So I think, the economic theory of this general equilibrium, which we reach sometime in the future, is wonderful. But until we get to that point, we need to make sure people don't die and they have healthcare and they have food to eat. So that's, in a way, the labor conversation, I think, that we need to have. There's a conversation around creativity. I think that's a whole panel and AI in itself. There's lots of pros and cons and copyright and all of these things involved. And I also think this whole narrative of everything will be AI, so we'll have so much free time to consume all the stuff AI creates. I don't know,
Great. I want to touch on the point about SMEs. Yes, some SMEs are informal and do not want to scale up because when they scale up, they become less profitable or unprofitable. But then we can use AI. There's a study we conducted where we took some SMEs in the food value chain. We trained them on how to translate or transition onto a digital platform. They could advertise, they could sell, people could order their products on the digital platform. And that, for me, is a way to scale up. So in as much as some do not want to scale up, others with the capacity, so like those who can read and write, can be helped to scale up. But it's not everybody. So certainly are not educated enough or are not tech savvy to be able to help them to scale up. Then the point about AI replacing human support systems is very much true. Previously, we had typewriters. Now, they are no more. We now have secretaries who type minutes and type, they are becoming less important. When we conduct field survey, we record and then transcribe manually. So we have people who listen and transcribe, and then we code. We have moved from that stage where now the voice can be put in a software, an AI software that will then transcribe, summarize nicely. You could buy for less than $100 and do all your transcription. So, and what is happening? And I think in as much as we are replacing human support systems, we're also creating other avenues where you can transcribe in a very short time and then write your report. Lastly, on policy, the gentleman spoke about policy. In my country, what I want to see is ethical behavior, a policy on ethical use of AI. Because you find somebody can pick your photograph, create something with AI, add some voice, something you have not said, especially those in political arena. You could be framed for saying certain things you have not said. So we need a policy to guide ethical behavior in terms of the use of AI. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, Bishop. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Nobel Prize writer from Latin America, wrote that during revolutions it's hard to tell the difference between reality and fantasy. So we are in this moment now. Now, if you look at the last 15 years, how we used to work, and now you will see the revolution there, right? It is there. So revolutions are not good by definition. For example, Elani talked about what we call the Engels pause, because during these years, Marx and Engels start writing about the proletariat. But in our countries, we never put the play again. We just keep the pause. So we don't know. I mean, what I believe is that we have time to act. So there's a revolution, but it doesn't mean that we will benefit. We need to do things differently. We need to think policies, be creative, and all that.
Wow, thank you, Ramiro. You had 2 minutes and you took one. I'm not going to add very much to this conversation anymore. A lot has already been said. I think if it were up to me and I could stuff the genie back in the bottle, put AI back in the bottle and close it, I would. But I'm very happy to know that I have great colleagues who are doing tremendous work, including my colleagues from JustJobs Network here that are scattered around, who are doing great work to look at how we can govern, how we can better understand and build an empirical base, really looking at how AI is affecting economies in the global south and what kind of regulations, policies, and governance frameworks we need to do the best that we can to harness the opportunities, minimize the benefits in this context that we've just discussed, and hoping that justice is at the center of all of that and that it's human-centered. So with that, I want to thank the Ministry of Electronics and IT for giving us this opportunity to partner with them for the AI Impact Summit. I want to thank all of you all for taking the time out to be here and to participate in this conversation. I think it was a really lively discussion. And last but not least, of course, my wonderful friends and colleagues and panelists that are here from all over the world. So a round of applause for everybody, and thank you. I hope you will all join us for tea, for high tea outside. Thank you.